Katya, isolated on a mountain with CEO Morgan, a passionate knight, leads to a shocking proposal. Hey everyone, welcome back to another heart-touching love story. First, a special thanks to all of you for the amazing love and appreciation on my last story. It truly means the world to me. Your support keeps me going, and your appreciation is my biggest motivation. If you're active and ready to watch today's blockbuster love story, please comment below with "active." I desperately want to know how many of you are truly engaged and loving these stories. Now, today's story is very special. It took me a minimum of 8 hours to write, pouring in deep emotions, romance and passion just for you. So sit back, relax, plug in your hands-free, and get ready to feel the depth of love and romance like never before. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heart-melting stories. Now, let's dive into the world of love. The private jet hummed steadily as it soared through the sky, cutting through the clouds with effortless grace. Inside the lavish cabin, CEO Morgan Steele sat with his usual composed demeanor, his sharp blue eyes scanning the business reports in his hands. Everything about him radiated power, his chiseled jaw, the tailored suit hugging his strong frame, and the air of authority that made even the most seasoned executives tremble. But today, his focus wavered, not because of a business deal, but because of the woman seated just across from him, his secretary, Katya. She was typing diligently on her laptop, her delicate fingers gliding over the keys, completely unaware of the occasional glances Morgan stole in her direction. Katya had worked for him for over a year, proving herself to be more than just an efficient assistant. She was intelligent, graceful, and unshakably loyal. And yet, for the first time, Morgan found himself looking at her in a way he never had before. The soft glow of the cabin lights illuminated her flawless skin, her long, silky brown hair cascading over her shoulders, framing her beautiful face. Dressed in a fitted business suit that did little to hide her perfect curves, she was an undeniable vision. But it wasn't just her physical beauty that held his attention. It was the quiet confidence in her posture, the warmth in her amber eyes, and the soft scent of jasmine that seemed to surround her. Something about her presence stirred something foreign within him, something he wasn't used to feeling. Desire, curiosity, an urge to understand her beyond the professional walls they had built. The intercom crackled, breaking the silence. "Sir, we have a situation. A sudden storm is forming in the mountain range. It's not safe to continue the flight." The pilot's voice was calm, but there was an edge of urgency beneath it. Morgan frowned, setting his report down. "Can we reroute?" he asked, but the answer was clear, even before the pilot responded. "Negative, sir. The nearest safe landing spot is a small airstrip near the mountains. We'll have to stay overnight until the storm passes." Katya looked up, concern flickering in her eyes. "Is it dangerous?" she asked softly, her voice smooth yet laced with worry. Morgan shook his head. "No, just inconvenient." His voice was composed, reassuring, but even he knew that nature was unpredictable. Within minutes, the jet began its descent, and soon they touched down on the deserted airstrip surrounded by towering, mist-covered mountains. The air was crisp and carried the earthy scent of the wilderness, a stark contrast to the polished city life they were used to. A black SUV awaited them, provided by the local airstrip personnel. Morgan and Katya stepped inside, and the driver, an older man with a rugged face, gave them a cautious glance. "Storm's coming in fast. Best find shelter before nightfall," he warned, before driving them through the winding mountain roads. But fate had different plans. Halfway through the journey, the storm arrived earlier than expected. Fierce winds howled, rain poured in violent sheets, and the visibility dropped to almost nothing. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the air as a tree collapsed onto the road ahead, blocking their path completely. The driver cursed under his breath. "Damn it! We can't go forward, and turning back is impossible with this storm." Morgan clenched his jaw, thinking fast. "Is there any shelter nearby?" The driver nodded. "There's an old ranger's cabin not far from here. It's abandoned, but it'll keep you safe until morning." Without hesitation, Morgan took charge. "Take us there." Within minutes, they arrived at a small wooden cabin nestled in the thick woods. The storm raged outside, the wind howling like a beast, shaking the very foundation of the structure. The driver left them with a lantern and some emergency supplies before heading back to the airstrip, leaving Morgan and Katya alone. The cabin was simple: one large room with a fireplace, a rustic wooden bed, and a small kitchenette. It was far from luxury, but it was warm and dry. Katya shivered, rubbing her arms. "Looks like we're stuck here for the night," she murmured, glancing out the window as lightning split the sky. Morgan removed his coat and placed it over her shoulders without a word. The small gesture made her heart skip a beat. "I'll get the fireplace going," he said, his voice deep and smooth. She watched as he crouched down, expertly stacking the firewood and striking a match. Within moments, flames flickered to life, casting a golden glow across the room. The warmth was immediate, but Katya's heart pounded for a different reason now. The intimate setting, the isolation, the way the firelight danced against Morgan's sculpted features. It was all too much. Morgan leaned back against the couch, watching her with an unreadable expression. "Come sit, Katya. No point in standing around freezing." She hesitated for only a moment before walking over and lowering herself onto the couch beside him. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension. "I didn't expect our business trip to turn into a survival adventure," she finally said with a nervous laugh, trying to break the intensity. Morgan smirked, his lips curving into a rare, genuine smile. "Neither did I. But maybe it's not such a bad thing." His voice dropped slightly, and Katya felt the weight of his gaze on her. She turned her head to meet his eyes, only to find an intensity she wasn't prepared for. His usual cold, calculating stare was gone, replaced with something else, something raw, something primal. "Morgan," she whispered, unsure of what she was about to say, but before she could find the words, he reached out, his fingers grazing her cheek, his touch burning despite its softness. "You smell incredible," he murmured, his voice husky, filled with something she couldn't quite name. Her breath hitched, the air between them crackled like the storm outside, charged with something powerful, undeniable. "Katya." He said her name like a prayer, like a confession. And before she could second-guess herself, before logic could step in, she closed the distance between them. Their lips met in a slow, heated kiss, one that sent shivers down her spine and set her entire body aflame. Morgan groaned, his control slipping as he deepened the kiss, pulling her onto his lap with ease. His hands explored her curves, memorizing every inch of her. She melted against him, completely surrendering to the moment, to him. The storm outside faded into the background. The only thing that existed was the heat between them, the undeniable pull that had been simmering beneath the surface for too long. When they finally pulled away, breathless, foreheads pressed together, Morgan cupped her face gently. "I don't know what's happening to me," he admitted, his voice rough with desire, with something deeper. "But I know one thing. I don't want this night to end." Katya swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her chest. "Then don't let it," she whispered, and with that she sealed their fate. The crackling fire cast flickering golden hues across the rustic wooden cabin, illuminating the raw hunger in Morgan's stormy blue eyes as he gazed at Katya, still perched on his lap, her delicate fingers resting against his broad chest. The air between them was thick with tension, a wildfire of emotions neither could contain any longer. The storm outside raged with fury, the howling wind and torrential rain beating against the cabin walls, but the storm inside them was far more dangerous. Morgan's pulse thundered as he trailed his fingers along the curve of Katya's jaw, tilting her face up to meet his intense gaze. Her amber eyes, wide and searching, reflected both hesitation and longing, and he could feel the rapid rise and fall of her chest as her breath grew uneven. "Katya," his voice was low, husky, dripping with a desire he could no longer suppress. He had spent years building walls around his heart, keeping emotions at bay, focusing solely on business, success, power. But in this moment none of that mattered. All that existed was her. Her intoxicating scent, her flawless skin, the way her lips parted slightly as if waiting for him to claim them again. Katya swallowed hard, her mind spinning as she fought against the storm of feelings inside her. This was her boss, the man she had admired from a distance for so long, the man who commanded boardrooms with a single look, who could strike fear into the hearts of his competitors with nothing but his icy composure. And yet here he was, staring at her like she was the only thing in the world he needed. The weight of his strong hands on her waist burned through the fabric of her blouse, sending shivers down her spine. "Morgan, this is—" she began, but her words trailed off as he leaned in, his breath warm against her lips. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his fingers tightening slightly on her hips. "Tell me, and I will." But she didn't. She couldn't. Because despite all the logic screaming at her, despite the warning bells ringing in her mind, her body betrayed her. She wanted this, wanted him. With a shaky breath she reached up, threading her fingers through his dark hair, feeling the silky strands between her fingertips. That was all the confirmation Morgan needed. A deep growl rumbled in his chest as he crushed his lips against hers, the kiss no longer gentle but desperate, consuming. His hands roamed her back, pressing her closer, as if trying to mold their bodies into one. Katya whimpered against his mouth, overwhelmed by the intensity of it all. His touch was fire, igniting something inside her she had never felt before. The way his lips moved against hers, the way his hands traced the curves of her body, it was as if he was memorizing her, worshipping her. Morgan was losing control. Something that had never happened before. He was always calculated, always in command, but with Katya he was unraveling. The scent of jasmine and vanilla clung to her skin, driving him mad. He lifted her effortlessly, carrying her across the small space of the cabin and lowering her onto the soft, worn-out mattress in the corner. He hovered over her, his eyes dark, with something primal, something possessive. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his fingers tracing down her arm, sending goosebumps in their wake. Katya bit her lip, her cheeks burning under his gaze. No man had ever looked at her the way Morgan did now, as if she was a rare treasure, something precious. "Morgan," she breathed, her voice trembling with anticipation. He leaned down, brushing his lips along her collarbone, his fingers exploring her body with slow, deliberate movements. Every touch sent waves of pleasure coursing through her, making her arch into him, craving more. The storm outside mirrored the storm within them, lightning illuminating the cabin in sharp flashes, casting shadows that danced across the walls. Time lost all meaning as they drowned in each other, lost in a night of unrestrained passion. Morgan was relentless, worshipping every inch of her, his kisses leaving trails of fire across her skin. Katya had never felt anything like this before, never imagined that desire could be so consuming, so utterly overwhelming. She surrendered to him completely, letting go of all inhibitions, all doubts. Hours passed, the storm outside eventually calming, but inside the cabin, their fire still burned. Katya lay curled against Morgan's chest, his strong arms wrapped around her protectively. The rhythmic sound of his heartbeat was steady beneath her ear, grounding her in the reality of what had just happened. She should have felt regret, should have worried about what this meant for them, but all she felt was peace, a deep, unshakable sense of belonging. Morgan's fingers traced lazy circles on her bare shoulder, his other hand tangled in her hair. He had never held a woman like this before, never wanted to keep someone close after the passion had faded. But with Katya, everything was different. He didn't want to let go. A heavy silence filled the room, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, the kind that wrapped around them like a cocoon. Finally, Katya found her voice. "What happens now?" she whispered, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the hard planes of his chest. Morgan exhaled slowly, tightening his hold on her. "Now." He paused, as if choosing his words carefully, but then, with unwavering certainty, he murmured, "Now, you're mine." Her breath caught, and she lifted her head to look at him. "Morgan, we can't." But he silenced her with a deep, lingering kiss. "I don't care about the rules, Katya. I don't care about what's expected of me or what anyone else thinks. All I know is that I want you, and I don't intend to stop." Katya's heart pounded in her chest as his words sank in. This wasn't just a moment of weakness for him. This wasn't just passion. This was something more, something deeper. "You don't know what you're saying," she murmured, but he shook his head. "I know exactly what I'm saying. You think I can go back to how things were after this? After you?" He cupped her face, his thumb brushing over her swollen lips. "I want more, Katya. More nights like this. More of you. And I don't care what I have to do to make that happen." Her eyes searched his, looking for any sign of hesitation, but all she found was raw, unfiltered honesty. "Morgan." Her voice was barely a whisper, but he heard it. He heard everything. And he knew in that moment that he would never let her go. The storm had brought them together, but now it was up to them to decide what came next. And as Morgan pulled her close once more, pressing his lips to hers with all the promise of a man who had made his decision, Katya realized that there was no turning back. The morning arrived with a golden hue streaming through the cracks of the wooden cabin, casting soft patterns across the worn-out mattress where Morgan and Katya lay tangled in each other's warmth. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crisp freshness in the mountain air, but inside the cabin, an entirely different kind of storm lingered, a storm of emotions neither of them had prepared for. Katya stirred first, her lashes fluttering open as she felt the steady rise and fall of Morgan's chest beneath her cheek. Her heart clenched at the reality of their closeness, her fingers instinctively tightening against his bare skin before she quickly pulled away, realizing what she had done. Heat rushed to her cheeks as the memories of the night flooded her mind. His touch, his kisses, the way he had unraveled her with nothing more than a whisper of her name. It had been unlike anything she had ever experienced before, and yet the weight of it all pressed down on her now. She turned slightly, intending to slip away quietly, but before she could move, a strong arm tightened around her waist, pulling her back against his body. "Going somewhere?" Morgan's voice was husky with sleep, sending shivers down her spine. She hesitated, her lips parting, but no words came out. How could she explain the storm of thoughts raging in her mind? She had crossed a line with her boss, a man who had always been unattainable, and yet here she was, lying beside him, as if she belonged there. I just thought I should freshen up, she finally managed to say, her voice softer than she intended. Morgan loosened his grip slightly, but didn't let go. Instead, he shifted, propping himself up on one elbow to study her face, his intense blue eyes searching hers. "Regrets?" he asked, his tone unreadable. Katya swallowed hard, shaking her head before she even realized what she was doing. "No," she admitted, barely above a whisper, "but this changes everything, Morgan." His expression darkened slightly, his jaw tightening, as if he already knew the battle going on inside her mind. "Yes, it does," he agreed, his fingers brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "And I don't intend to pretend it didn't happen." His words sent a fresh wave of emotions crashing over her. There was no hesitation in his voice, no regret, only certainty. He wanted more of her, more of what had happened last night. And deep down, she knew she wanted it too. But reality was never that simple. They were stranded in this cabin, away from the real world, and everything felt heightened, intensified by the isolation. What would happen once they returned to their normal lives? Could they simply go back to being boss and secretary, pretending that this night of passion had never happened? She wasn't sure she could. "Morgan, this isn't just about us," she said carefully, trying to find the right words. "You're the CEO of a billion-dollar company. I'm your secretary. People will talk. And what if it's just the situation making us feel this way?" Morgan's eyes darkened with something dangerous, something possessive. "You think this is just because of the situation?" His voice was low, almost challenging. He reached out, tilting her chin so that she was forced to meet his gaze. "Katya, I've wanted you for a long time." Her breath hitched, her eyes widening. "What?" she whispered. He exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening against her skin. "You think I never noticed you, that I never thought about you?" He shook his head, his expression almost frustrated. "I kept my distance because I thought it was the right thing to do. I told myself I couldn't mix business with personal desires, but last night when I had you in my arms, when I tasted you, I knew I could never go back." Katya's heart pounded in her chest, her pulse erratic. She had never expected this, not from Morgan. He had always been so cold, so untouchable, and yet here he was, confessing that he'd been fighting this for longer than she even realized. Her throat tightened, emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Morgan, I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice trembling. He studied her for a moment before leaning in, brushing his lips against her forehead with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "Then don't say anything," he murmured. "Just stay." For a moment she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, they could exist in this bubble a little longer. She melted into him, allowing herself to bask in the warmth of his embrace, to forget the outside world for just a little while. But fate had other plans. A sharp sound shattered the peaceful morning, the distinct crackle of a radio. Katya jolted upright, her heart hammering in her chest as Morgan cursed under his breath, quickly getting out of bed and grabbing his discarded shirt. He moved toward the source of the sound, the emergency radio they had found the night before but assumed was dead due to the storm. Static filled the cabin before a voice broke through, crackling with interference. "If anyone can hear this, the storm has passed. Helicopters are being sent for search and rescue. Over." Katya's breath caught in her throat. They were being rescued. They would be going back. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, and suddenly the warmth of Morgan's arms around her felt like a fleeting dream, slipping through her fingers before she could even grasp it. Morgan turned to her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, they held a silent promise. "We'll talk about this when we're back," he said firmly. "This isn't over, Katya." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to hold on to the fire that had ignited between them, but doubts gnawed at the edges of her mind. What if everything changed once they stepped off this mountain? What if reality shattered the fragile connection they had built here? But before she could voice her fears, Morgan closed the distance between them, cupping her face and pressing a searing kiss to her lips, as if branding his promise into her very soul. "You're mine," he whispered against her mouth, his breath hot and possessive. "And I don't care what it takes. I'm not letting you go." Her heart clenched at his words, a mix of fear and longing twisting inside her, because despite all her uncertainties, one truth remained: she didn't want him to let go. As the distant sound of helicopter blades grew louder, signaling the end of their isolation, Katya knew that whatever awaited them beyond this mountain, whether it was chaos or clarity, one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The sound of helicopter blades cutting through the crisp mountain air sent a shiver down Katya's spine, not because of the cold, but because of the reality it carried with it. Their time in isolation was over. What had felt like a hidden world, where only she and Morgan existed, a world where their passion burned without restraint, was about to be left behind. She stood frozen at the cabin's threshold, watching as the rescue team descended with efficiency, their voices crackling over radios, their movements mechanical as they prepared to take them back. Morgan stood beside her, his presence a steady heat against her skin, but she couldn't bring herself to look at him. She was afraid. Afraid that the moment their feet touched the civilized ground again, everything that had happened between them would turn into nothing more than a memory. Would Morgan still look at her the same way? Would he still crave her the way he had in that cabin? Or was she just a moment of weakness for him, a fleeting indulgence that had no place in his real world? As the rescue team ushered them toward the helicopter, Morgan placed a firm hand on the small of her back, guiding her forward. But the possessiveness in his touch didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. When she hesitated at the edge of the helicopter, overwhelmed by the rapid shift in their circumstances, Morgan turned to her, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that made the world around them disappear. "This doesn't end here," he said, his voice low and unwavering, drowning out the noise of the helicopter. "I meant every word, Katya. I'm not letting you go." Her breath caught, her fingers clenching into fists as she fought the emotions storming inside her, but before she could respond, before she could decide whether to cling to his words or protect herself from heartbreak, she was ushered inside, and the helicopter lifted off the ground. The flight back to civilization was painfully silent. Katya kept her gaze fixed on the mountains below, watching as the place that had changed everything for her disappeared beneath them. Morgan sat beside her, his arm resting on the back of her seat, his presence overwhelming, but he didn't speak. Maybe he sensed her turmoil. Maybe he was lost in his own thoughts, but the silence between them felt fragile, as if one wrong move could shatter everything. When they finally landed, the chaos of reality hit them immediately. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, journalists shouting questions about the billionaire CEO's unexpected disappearance. Security pushed through the crowd, escorting them toward waiting cars, and for the first time since that night, Katya felt like an outsider in Morgan's world again. He was back to being the powerful CEO, untouchable, unreachable, and she was just his secretary. Her heart twisted painfully as she watched him interact with his staff, issuing orders with his usual sharp precision. The man who had held her so tenderly, who had whispered promises into her skin, was now composed, unreadable, and it terrified her. Was this it? Was this how it ended? She was being foolish. What had she expected? That he would sweep her into his arms in front of the entire world and declare that she was his, that their passionate night would somehow change everything. Reality didn't work that way. As they reached the sleek black car waiting for them, Morgan turned to her, his fingers wrapping around her wrist before she could step away. "Get in," he ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. Katya hesitated, glancing at the other car waiting for her, the one meant to take her home. "I should—" "Get in," he repeated, softer this time, but just as firm. His eyes burned with something fierce, something possessive. "We're not done, Katya." Her pulse raced as she slid into the car, and the moment the door closed behind them, the tension in the air became suffocating. Morgan didn't waste a second. He turned to her, his fingers tilting her chin up, so she had no choice but to meet his gaze. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice a dangerous whisper. She swallowed hard, her throat tight. Of what? Of what happens next? Yes, she was, because she had no idea where this was going, and she was terrified of wanting something that might never be real. "Morgan, we were alone on that mountain," she forced herself to say, trying to be rational despite the fire in his eyes. "Things were different there, but this is your world, and I don't fit in it." His jaw clenched, his grip tightening. "You think what happened between us was just because of where we were?" His voice was edged with frustration. "You think I don't know the difference between desire and something real?" "Was it real?" she whispered, barely able to say the words out loud. His eyes darkened, his hand moving to cradle the side of her face. "You are real to me, Katya. More real than anything I've had in my life." Her heart slammed against her ribs, her breath catching as his lips hovered just above hers, teasing her, tormenting her. "But I need to know something," he continued, his voice low and dangerous. "Do you want this? Do you want me?" The answer burned inside her, screaming to be spoken, but fear held her back. If she said yes, she would be stepping into a world she didn't belong to, risking everything. But if she said no, she would be walking away from the only thing that had ever made her feel truly alive. "Say it, Katya," he demanded, his lips brushing against hers with each word. "Say you want me." A war raged inside her, but in the end, there was only one truth. One undeniable, inescapable truth. "Yes," she breathed, her voice trembling. "I want you." The moment the words left her lips, Morgan claimed them with his own, kissing her with a desperation that made her dizzy. His hands tangled in her hair, his body pressing against hers, as if he wanted to erase every inch of distance between them. The kiss was possessive, hungry, as if he needed to remind her that she belonged to him, and maybe she did. By the time they arrived at his penthouse, Katya's mind was a whirlwind of emotions, her body still tingling from his touch. But as she stepped inside, the reality of what she had just agreed to hit her full force. She wasn't just Morgan's secretary anymore. She was something more, something deeper, and there was no turning back. Morgan stood behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders, his lips brushing against the shell of her ear. "You're mine now, Katya," he murmured, his voice sending a shiver down her spine. "And I'm never letting you go." Her breath hitched, her pulse wild. She had taken the leap. Now there was no telling where they would land. Katya barely had time to process the weight of Morgan's words before he turned her around and captured her lips in another searing kiss. His hands were firm on her waist, pulling her against him with a desperate kind of hunger, as if the hours since they had left the mountain had only intensified his need for her, and perhaps they had. Because, for her, every second away from him had felt like torment, a slow, agonizing unraveling of something she wasn't ready to lose. The city lights glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Morgan's penthouse, a stark contrast to the wild, untouched beauty of the mountains where they had first surrendered to each other. Yet, despite the change in setting, the fire between them remained the same, unrelenting and consuming. Katya's fingers trembled as they fisted in the fabric of his suit, holding on to him as if he were the only thing keeping her anchored. His lips moved against hers with a possessive dominance, his breath hot and demanding, his body pressing against hers in a way that made her knees weak. "You don't know what you've done to me, Katya," he murmured against her lips, his voice rough with emotion. "Can't stop thinking about you. I don't want to stop." Her heart pounded as he lifted her effortlessly, carrying her toward the plush velvet couch that sat in the center of the grand living space. He lowered her onto it, his body covering hers as his lips trailed down her throat, his breath fanning over her skin, igniting flames everywhere he touched. Her fingers tangled in his hair, her body arching into him as a soft moan escaped her lips. Morgan groaned in response, his grip tightening as if he needed more of her, more of this, more of everything. And she wanted to give it to him. She wanted to surrender to this feeling, to lose herself in the way he made her feel. "Morgan." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough to make him pause, his dark eyes locking onto hers, searching, questioning. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice a deep, velvety rasp that sent shivers down her spine. Was she? Maybe. But not of him. Never of him. She was afraid of how deeply he affected her, how much she wanted him, how quickly he had become the center of her world. "No," she whispered, her fingers tracing the sharp angles of his jaw, memorizing the way he looked at her as if she was the only thing that mattered. "I just don't want this to be a dream." His expression darkened, something fierce flashing in his gaze as he cupped her face with both hands, forcing her to see the truth in his eyes. "This isn't a dream, Katya," he vowed, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't want just one night with you. I want every night. I want forever." Her breath hitched, her heart slamming against her ribs. Forever. It was too much. It was everything. And yet, the moment he said it, she realized she wanted it too. She wanted him, not just in this moment, but always. But how could they have forever? He was a billionaire CEO, powerful and untouchable, and she was just his secretary, his obsession, his weakness. "Morgan," she started, but he silenced her with a kiss, slow and deep, filled with a promise she wasn't sure she was ready to believe. "Don't run from me," he murmured against her lips. "I won't let you." A knock on the door shattered the moment, breaking the heated spell between them. Morgan growled in frustration, his forehead resting against hers as he took a deep breath before pulling away. "Stay here," he ordered, his eyes still dark with unfulfilled hunger. Katya nodded, watching as he straightened his suit and moved toward the door with the same commanding presence that made him so powerful in the corporate world. She took a shaky breath, trying to calm the storm inside her, but it was impossible. Everything was happening too fast, too intensely, and she didn't know how to handle it. Morgan's voice was sharp as he spoke to whoever was on the other side of the door, his tone irritated. Katya couldn't make out the words, but she could hear the tension in his voice. And then, just as quickly as it started, The conversation was over, and he was back, his expression unreadable. "Who was it?" she asked softly, her stomach twisting with unease. Morgan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Someone who doesn't matter." But something in his eyes told her otherwise. There was a storm brewing beneath the surface, something dark and possessive, something dangerous. "Katya!" he said suddenly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Move in with me!" Her breath caught. "What?" "I don't want you staying in that tiny apartment anymore. I want you here, with me." His words sent a thrill through her, but they also terrified her. This was moving too fast, wasn't it? But when she looked into his eyes, she saw only certainty, only a hunger that refused to be denied. He didn't just want her. He needed her. And she was beginning to realize she needed him, too. "Say yes," he demanded, his fingers brushing against her cheek. "Say you'll be mine." Her heart pounded, her mind screaming at her to be rational, to slow down. But her soul already belonged to him. "Yes," she whispered, sealing her fate with one simple word. Morgan's expression darkened with satisfaction, his lips curling into a victorious smirk. "Good," he murmured, pulling her into his arms once more. "Because I'm never letting you go, Katya." And as his lips claimed hers again, she knew there was no turning back. She had stepped into the fire, and there was no escaping it now. But maybe she didn't want to. The city glowed beneath them, like a sea of stars. But Katya barely noticed as she stood by the window of Morgan's penthouse, her fingers pressed lightly against the cool glass. Her heart was still racing from the intensity of his words, from the way he had claimed her, as if there was no doubt in his mind that she belonged to him. "Move in with me." The words echoed in her mind over and over again, stirring a storm of emotions inside her. She had said yes. She had agreed. And now there was no turning back. A part of her was still overwhelmed, still struggling to believe that this was real, that Morgan, the powerful and untouchable CEO, wanted her in his life, not just as his secretary, not just as a passing desire, but as something more, as something permanent. She turned, her gaze drawn to the man who had turned her world upside down. Morgan stood by the bar, pouring himself a drink, his suit jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong, tanned forearms. He looked like a king surveying his empire, his presence commanding, his expression unreadable. But when he lifted his gaze to hers, the fire in his eyes was undeniable. "You're quiet," he said, his voice smooth yet laced with something deeper, something possessive. "Are you having second thoughts?" Katya swallowed, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. "No," she admitted softly. I don't know how to process all of this." Morgan set his glass down and crossed the room in a few powerful strides, stopping just inches from her. His scent surrounded her, intoxicating and familiar, making her knees weak. He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her skin. "Then don't think," he murmured, his voice low and hypnotic. "Just feel." And then his lips were on hers, claiming, demanding, as if he needed to remind her that there was no room for doubt between them. The moment his mouth moved against hers, every hesitation, every uncertainty melted away. She surrendered to him completely, her arms wrapping around his neck as he lifted her effortlessly, carrying her through the vast penthouse without breaking the kiss. When he laid her down on the massive bed, his body covering hers, she knew there was no going back. This was her reality now, this passion, this hunger, this man. He was hers, and she was his. Morgan's hands explored her body with slow, deliberate movements, memorizing every inch of her, branding her as his. His lips trailed down her throat across her collarbone, setting her skin on fire. "You have no idea what you do to me, Katya," he murmured against her skin, his voice thick with desire. "No idea how much I crave you." She gasped as he deepened his touch, her body arching into him, desperate for more. The intensity of his need, the raw possessiveness in his touch, it was almost too much, yet not enough at the same time. He worshipped her, cherished her as if she was the most precious thing in his world. And maybe, just maybe, she was. Time lost meaning as they surrendered to the passion between them, their bodies tangled in the sheets, their breaths mingling in the stillness of the night. When it was over, Morgan pulled her against his chest, his fingers trailing lazily down her spine. "You're mine now," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her hair. "And I'm never letting you go." Katya closed her eyes, letting his words sink into her heart. She knew there would be challenges ahead, that the world outside this penthouse wouldn't understand what they had, but in this moment, none of it mattered. Because here, in Morgan's arms, she had found something she never knew she was missing: love, passion, and a home in the most unexpected place. As sleep began to pull her under, she heard Morgan's voice once more, soft but firm. "Tomorrow, we start our life together." And as she drifted into dreams filled with his touch, his voice, and his love, she knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Katya stirred awake to the sensation of warmth enveloping her. A steady rhythm beneath her ear, the strong, comforting heartbeat of Morgan. His arm was draped over her waist, his body curved protectively around hers, as if even in sleep he refused to let her go. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the soft morning light filtering through the sheer curtains of the penthouse bedroom. The events of the past night came rushing back to her, his words, his touch, the way he had consumed her entirely, leaving no space for doubt, only raw, undeniable passion. She had never felt this way before, cherished, wanted, and most dangerously of all, loved. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Could it be love? Could Morgan truly see her as more than just his secretary, more than a fleeting obsession? Or was she allowing herself to get lost in a fantasy that could shatter at any moment? Before she could drown in her thoughts, a low groan rumbled from behind her. Morgan shifted, tightening his hold on her, his lips brushing against her bare shoulder in a sleepy caress. "You're awake!" His voice was husky, deep with the remnants of sleep, yet there was already a possessive edge to it, like a man who had claimed something and was unwilling to part with it. "Why do I feel like you're overthinking?" Katya bit her lip, hesitating for a moment before turning in his embrace to meet his gaze. His dark eyes, still heavy with sleep, searched hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. She hesitated, unsure of how to voice the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "This is happening so fast, Morgan. Last week I was just your secretary. Now I'm here in your bed, waking up beside you, moving in with you. I just don't want to be something temporary." His expression hardened instantly, a storm brewing behind his eyes as he sat up, pulling her with him. His grip on her chin was firm, but gentle as he forced her to look at him. "Temporary," he repeated, his tone dangerous, as if the very idea was offensive. "Do you really think I would go this far if I saw you as something temporary?" Katya swallowed, feeling her heart race under the sheer dominance in his voice. "I don't know," she admitted softly. "You're a powerful man, Morgan. You could have anyone. I just don't understand why it's me." A muscle ticked in his jaw as he let out a sharp breath, his fingers tightening slightly. "Because it's always been you, Katya," he said, his voice raw with something she wasn't sure she'd ever heard from him before: vulnerability. That night on the mountain didn't change anything. It only made me realize what was already there. You've been driving me insane for months, and I was too damn stubborn to admit it. But now that I have you, I'm never letting you go." Her heart pounded against her ribs as his words wrapped around her like a promise, a dangerous, intoxicating promise she wasn't sure she could resist. And yet, doubt still lingered in the corners of her mind. "But what about your life? Your company? The world you live in is different from mine, Morgan. People will talk. They'll judge." His expression darkened, his fingers slipping under her chin to tilt her face up. "Let them talk," he said simply. "Let them judge. I don't give a damn what anyone thinks. You're mine, Katya, and I won't let anything take you away from me." Before she could argue, his lips crashed against hers, silencing every insecurity, every fear, every doubt. He kissed her as if he was proving something, as if he was branding his promise into her soul. And she couldn't fight it. She didn't want to, because when Morgan kissed her, nothing else in the world existed. When he pulled away, his eyes burned with unwavering determination. "I don't just want you in my bed, Katya," he murmured. "I want you in my life, in every way, and I will do whatever it takes to make you believe that." Katya's breath hitched as his words settled deep within her heart. Maybe this wasn't just an affair. Maybe this wasn't just an impulsive decision. Maybe, just maybe, Morgan meant every word. And if he did, if he truly saw her as more than just a passing flame, then maybe it was time she stopped fighting it. A small smile tugged at her lips as she traced the strong line of his jaw. "Okay," she whispered. Morgan arched a brow. "Okay." She nodded, her fingers tangling in his hair as she pulled him closer. "Okay," she repeated, her voice stronger this time. "I'll stop overthinking. I'll trust you." A slow, satisfied smirk curved his lips before he claimed her mouth again, sealing her words with another possessive kiss. "Good," he murmured against her lips, "because now that I have you, I'm never letting go." And as he pulled her beneath him once more, showing her with every touch, every kiss, every whispered promise, just how deeply he meant it, Katya knew that she had fallen into something far greater than she had ever imagined, and there was no escaping it now. Katya felt the shift in her life the moment she stepped into Morgan's world completely. Moving in with him wasn't just about sharing a space, it was about stepping into the life of a man who had once seemed so untouchable, so out of reach. She had spent years watching him from behind the scenes, booking his flights, organizing his meetings, making sure his schedule ran without a hitch. But now, she was no longer just his secretary. She was his. And that thought alone sent a shiver through her body, not from fear, but from the overwhelming rush of emotions she had never experienced before. She had woken up in his arms, tangled in silk sheets that smelled of him, her body still aching from the passion of the night before. Every part of her had been claimed, worshipped, devoured by Morgan, and yet the way he had held her after, the way his lips had pressed against her forehead as he murmured promises she never thought she would hear, it made her realize that this wasn't just lust. This wasn't just another one of Morgan's conquests. It was something deeper, something dangerous, something that could consume her whole. She wrapped the bedsheet around herself as she stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the sunrise paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson. The city below was waking up, but inside this penthouse, time felt like it had slowed, like she was standing on the edge of something irreversible. She didn't hear Morgan approach until she felt the heat of his body behind her, the solid press of his chest against her back, his hands sliding around her waist, pulling her against him. "You're up early. he murmured against her shoulder, his lips brushing against her bare skin, sending a shiver down her spine. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted softly, tilting her head as his lips continued their slow, torturous exploration of her neck. Morgan smirked against her skin. "I'll take the blame for that." His voice was thick with satisfaction, his hands gripping her hips possessively. "Did I wear you out, sweetheart?" Katya felt her cheeks burn, but she couldn't deny the truth. He had. And yet, despite the exhaustion, her body still craved him, still longed for the way he made her feel, like she was the only thing in his world. "Maybe a little," she confessed, feeling his arms tighten around her. Morgan chuckled, a deep, rich sound that vibrated through her body. "Good," he whispered, turning her in his arms so he could see her face. His dark eyes locked onto hers, filled with something intense, something that made her breath hitch. "Because I don't plan on stopping any time soon." Before she could respond, his lips crashed against hers, stealing her breath, stealing every coherent thought from her mind. He kissed her as if he was making another claim, another promise, his hands roaming her body, reminding her exactly who she belonged to. The sheet she had wrapped around herself slipped from her grasp, pooling at their feet, but she didn't care. Not when Morgan was lifting her effortlessly, carrying her back to the bed, as if he couldn't stand to be apart from her for even a second. Hours passed in a blur of tangled limbs, whispered moans, and soft gasps as Morgan took his time worshipping her all over again. He wasn't just making love to her, he was binding her to him, making sure she knew that there was no escape, no turning back. And she didn't want to. She wanted to drown in him, in the way he touched her, the way he said her name, like it was the only one that had ever mattered. When they finally lay breathless in each other's arms, Katya traced lazy circles on his bare chest, her head resting against his heart. "Morgan," she murmured, hesitating for a moment before lifting her gaze to his. "What happens now?" Morgan propped himself up on one elbow, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Now," he said, his voice laced with certainty, "we live together." She swallowed, her heart pounding. "And your company, your reputation, the media will—" Morgan silenced her with a kiss, his lips moving against hers with a gentleness that made her chest tighten. "I told you before, I don't care what anyone thinks," he whispered. "The only thing that matters is you, us." Katya felt her throat tighten. She had spent so long doubting, so long questioning whether this was real, but the way Morgan looked at her, the way he held her, she knew he wasn't letting go. And neither was she. As she curled against him, listening to the steady beat of his heart, she realized that for the first time in her life, she wasn't just existing. She was living. And with Morgan by her side, she knew that this was only the beginning. Katya had always believed that love was something slow and delicate, something that took years to develop, to blossom into something meaningful. But with Morgan, it wasn't slow. It was a storm, a wildfire, a force that consumed her entirely. Every moment spent in his arms only deepened her emotions, tethering her to him in a way that felt unbreakable. The way he looked at her, touched her, claimed her as if she was the most precious thing in his world, left no room for doubt. But even as she drowned in his passion, as her body ached with the remnants of the nights they spent tangled together, a lingering fear still clung to the edges of her mind. Could something this intense, this all-consuming, truly last? The city lights sparkled beneath them as Katya stood on the penthouse balcony, wrapped in nothing but Morgan's shirt. The cool night air brushed against her skin, sending a shiver down her spine. She exhaled, her mind racing with emotion she couldn't quite name. Behind her, she could hear the faint sounds of Morgan moving inside the penthouse, the clink of glasses, the deep timbre of his voice as he spoke to someone on the phone. He was always busy, always in control, always the powerful CEO the world knew him to be. And yet, when he was with her, he was different. He was softer, more possessive, more unrestrained in his desire. She closed her eyes, replaying the way he'd made love to her just hours ago, how he had whispered her name like a prayer, how his lips had traced every inch of her body as if memorizing her, how his hands had gripped her hips, holding her in place as he lost himself in her. Even now, her body still hummed from the intensity of it, from the way he had completely unraveled her. The sound of footsteps approaching pulled her from her thoughts. A moment later, strong arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her against the hard planes of his body. "You're thinking again," Morgan murmured against her ear, his lips brushing over her skin, sending a wave of heat through her. Katya sighed, leaning back into his embrace. "I can't help it," she admitted softly. "Everything is happening so fast." Morgan turned her in his arms, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a fire that made her breath catch. "Do you regret it?" His voice was low, dangerous, as if the thought of her regretting them was something he couldn't bear. Katya's heart clenched at the vulnerability hidden beneath his question. She reached up, cupping his face in her hands. "No," she whispered, "I don't regret any of it." A flicker of relief crossed his features before his expression darkened with something else, possession. "Good," he murmured before capturing her lips in a searing kiss. His grip on her tightened, his hand sliding beneath the fabric of his shirt, pressing her bare skin against his own. The kiss was demanding, raw, filled with an unspoken promise that sent a shiver down her spine. When he finally pulled away, his forehead rested against hers, his breath heavy. "You're mine, Katya," he whispered, his voice laced with a fierce determination. "No matter what happens, no matter what anyone says, you belong to me." A lump formed in her throat at the intensity of his words. She wanted to believe him, to trust that this wasn't just another fleeting affair for him. But the fear still lingered. A whisper in the back of her mind reminding her that she had never belonged in his world. As if sensing her hesitation, Morgan pulled her even closer. "I know what you're thinking," he murmured, his thumb brushing over her lower lip. "And I won't let you doubt this. Doubt us." Katya swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around his wrist. "Then prove it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Morgan's eyes darkened, his grip on her waist tightening. "I will," he promised, his voice filled with conviction. "Starting now." Before she could react, he lifted her effortlessly into his arms, carrying her back inside. The moment they crossed the threshold of the bedroom, he laid her down on the bed, his body hovering over hers. His eyes burned with something deeper than lust, something more powerful. "I will spend every night proving it to you," he vowed, his lips trailing down her neck, his hands exploring every inch of her body. "I will make you feel it, how much I need you, how much I can't live without you." And as the night stretched on, as Morgan showed her again and again just how deeply he meant his words, Katya knew there was no running from this, no running from him. She had fallen completely, irreversibly in love with Morgan, and there was no turning back. Katya lay beneath Morgan, her body still trembling from the passionate storm they had just shared, her skin burning where his hands had explored, her heart pounding with emotions that she could no longer contain. Every night spent in his arms felt like a revelation, a world where nothing else existed but the two of them, tangled in sheets, tangled in love, tangled in a passion so fierce it left her breathless. She'd surrendered to him completely, allowing him to claim her in ways she never imagined possible, and yet every time he touched her, every time his lips found hers, it felt like the first time all over again. She traced her fingers along his chiseled jawline, watching as he gazed at her with an intensity that made her feel weak, vulnerable, yet utterly safe. His dark eyes held a promise, a silent vow that he would never let her go, and for the first time in her life, Katya truly believed it. Morgan propped himself on his elbow, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from her flushed face. "You're thinking too much again," he murmured, his voice deep and husky from their lovemaking, his thumb caressing the delicate curve of her lips. Katya exhaled, tilting her head into his touch, her fingers splaying across his bare chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palm. "I can't help it," she admitted, her voice soft. "Everything between us. It's so intense, so overwhelming. I feel like I'm drowning in you." A smirk tugged at the corner of Morgan's lips as he leaned down, pressing a slow, lingering kiss against her lips before trailing down to her neck, his tongue tracing the sensitive skin there. "Then drown in me, sweetheart," he whispered against her pulse, his voice dark with need. "Because I have no intention of letting you go." A shiver ran through her, not from fear, but from the undeniable truth in his words. He wasn't just speaking empty promises. She could see it in his eyes, feel it in the way he held her, as if she was the only thing keeping him grounded. Morgan shifted, pulling her on top of him so that she straddled his waist, his hands gripping her hips with possessive force. He looked up at her, his gaze filled with something more than just desire. "Katya," he murmured, his fingers tightening their hold. "I don't just want you for a night. I don't just want you for now." His voice was laced with something raw, something real. "I want you forever." Katya's breath hitched, her hands trembling as she cupped his face, her fingers running through his thick hair. "Forever?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if she was afraid to believe it, afraid to hope. Morgan sat up, wrapping his arms around her waist, pressing his forehead against hers. "Forever," he confirmed, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was slow, deliberate, as if he was sealing his promise with every movement. "I want more nights like this. More mornings waking up beside you, more of everything that comes with loving you." Katya felt tears sting her eyes, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion in his voice. She had spent so long wondering if this was just a fleeting desire for him, if one day he would wake up and realize she was just his secretary, just a woman he had spent a passionate night with in the mountains. But hearing him say those words, feeling the way his heart beat in sync with hers, she knew this wasn't temporary, this was real. She swallowed the lump in her throat, her hands gripping his shoulders. "Morgan," she started, but he silenced her with another kiss, this one more demanding, more desperate, as if he needed to show her just how much he meant every word. His hands roamed her body again, igniting another fire within her, making her forget everything else but him. Their bodies moved together in a rhythm that spoke of something deeper than just physical desire. It was a dance of love, of two souls intertwining, of a promise unspoken, but deeply understood. And as they collapsed into each other once more, Katya knew she had already given herself to him completely in every way possible. Hours later, as they lay tangled in the sheets, their bodies still glistening with the remnants of their passion, Morgan pulled her against his chest, his fingers trailing lazily along her spine. "Marry me," he murmured suddenly, his voice deep and filled with certainty. Katya froze, her heart stopping for a brief second before picking up at a frantic pace. She lifted her head to meet his gaze, searching his face for any sign that he was joking, but there was none. He was completely serious. "Morgan," she breathed, her lips parting in shock. "I mean it, Katya," he said firmly, his fingers tilting her chin up so she had no choice but to look into his eyes. "I don't want to waste another second without you as mine." Be my wife. Katya's heart felt like it would burst from the intensity of his words. She had never expected this, never imagined that the man she had once only admired from a distance would now be lying beside her, asking her to be his forever. Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded, unable to find her voice through the overwhelming emotions choking her. "Yes," she finally whispered, her voice shaking. "Yes, Morgan." A triumphant smile spread across his face before he rolled her beneath him once more, capturing her lips in a kiss so passionate, so filled with love, that she knew she had made the right choice, because with Morgan there was no turning back. This was their forever. The moment Katya whispered, "Yes," Morgan felt something shift inside him, something irrevocable. It was as if the very core of his existence had been set aflame with a passion that could never be extinguished. He had always been a man in control of his business, his emotions, his entire life. But with Katya, he had lost that control in the most beautiful way possible. She had taken over his heart, his mind, his every waking thought, and now she was going to be his in the most permanent way. His wife. The mere thought sent a rush of possessive desire through him, a desperate need to claim her, to make sure she understood that from this moment on, she belonged to him in every possible way. Before Katya could even process the magnitude of what she had just agreed to, Morgan had captured her lips in a searing kiss, his hands gripping her waist with the kind of hunger that sent shivers down her spine. She melted against him, her fingers tangling in his hair as he deepened the kiss, his tongue sliding against hers in a slow, sensual dance that made her toes curl. She could feel the heat of his body pressing into hers, the tension in his muscles as he held himself back, as if he was afraid of losing himself completely. But she didn't want him to hold back. Not now. Not ever. "Morgan," she murmured against his lips, her breath hitching as he trailed his kisses down her jawline to the sensitive spot beneath her ear. "Show me. Show me how much you want me." A low growl rumbled in his chest as he flipped her onto her back, his eyes dark with desire as he hovered over her, his fingers tracing the curves of her body with a reverence that made her heart pound. "You have no idea," he rasped, his voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea how much I need you, Katya, how much I crave you." Her lips parted, a soft moan escaping as he trailed his kisses lower, his hands slipping beneath the thin fabric covering her body. Every touch, every kiss was a silent promise, a vow that he would worship her, cherish her, love her in a way no one else ever had. And as the night stretched on, as they lost themselves in each other over and over again, Katya knew she was his, in every way that mattered. When the morning light filtered through the penthouse windows, casting a golden glow over their tangled bodies, Katya stirred in Morgan's arms, her fingers tracing idle patterns across his bare chest. She felt sore in the best possible way, her entire being humming with the remnants of their passion. Morgan was still asleep, his strong arms wrapped possessively around her waist, his face buried in her hair. He looked peaceful, so unlike the powerful CEO the world saw him as. Here, with her, he was just a man who loved her, who wanted her in a way that defied reason. A soft smile touched her lips as she pressed a gentle kiss to his jawline. But before she could move, his arms tightened around her, pulling her back against him. "Where do you think you're going?" he murmured, his voice thick with sleep, yet still laced with that unmistakable dominance that sent a thrill down her spine. She chuckled softly, turning in his arms so she could look into his eyes. "I wasn't going anywhere," she whispered, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. I still can't believe this is real." Morgan's expression softened as he cupped her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. "It's real," he murmured, his gaze filled with something deeper than love. "And it's forever." Her heart swelled at his words, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Forever," she echoed, her voice barely more than a breath. Morgan pressed a lingering kiss to her forehead before pulling her onto his chest, his fingers threading through her hair. "We should start planning the wedding," he mused, a teasing glint in his eyes. "Unless you want to run away with me and get married right now." Katya laughed, her cheeks flushing at the thought. "As tempting as that sounds, I think we should take our time. I want to enjoy every moment with you." He sighed dramatically. "Fine, but don't think for a second that I'm going to let you out of my sight until then." She grinned, pressing a soft kiss to his lips. "I wouldn't have it any other way." And as they lay there, wrapped in each other's arms, Katya knew that no matter what happened, no matter where life took them, they would always find their way back to this, back to each other. Because what they had was more than love. It was fate. The morning sun poured through the wide glass windows, illuminating the luxurious penthouse with a golden hue. But Katya barely noticed the light. Her entire world was wrapped in the warmth of Morgan's arms, their bodies tangled beneath the silk sheets, skin against skin, heartbeat against heartbeat. She had never felt so cherished, so completely consumed by love, and as she traced her fingers along his toned chest, she knew that no matter what happened, this moment would stay etched in her soul forever. Last night had been more than just another night of passion. It had been a promise, a vow sealed in whispers, moans, and the heat of their entwined bodies. Morgan had made love to her with a desperation that spoke volumes. His touch, worshipping her, his lips branding her, his possessive hold leaving no doubt in her mind that she belonged to him. And she had given herself to him completely, allowing herself to drown in the storm of his love, to surrender to the fire that had been burning between them since the night they had been stranded on that mountain. Morgan stirred beside her, his grip tightening around her waist as he pulled her even closer, his lips pressing against the top of her head. "You're awake," he murmured, his deep voice still laced with sleep. Katya smiled, her fingers tracing lazy circles on his bare skin. "So are you," she teased, tilting her head up to meet his gaze. His dark eyes were filled with something indescribable, something raw and intense, and the way he looked at her made her heart race. "How could I sleep when I have you in my arms?" he murmured, his voice husky as he brushed his lips over her forehead, then her cheek, then lower, his touch setting her skin ablaze all over again. "You're too tempting, Katya." A shiver ran through her at the way he said her name, at the way his hands roamed her body as if he couldn't get enough of her. She bit her lip, her fingers gripping his shoulders as he rolled her onto her back, hovering over her with that familiar look of hunger in his eyes. "Morgan," she whispered, her breath hitching as he trailed his lips down her neck, his tongue teasing the sensitive skin there. His fingers tangled in her hair as he gazed down at her, his expression turning serious. "Do you know what you do to me, Katya?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Do you have any idea how much I need you?" Her heart clenched at his words, at the sheer intensity in his gaze. "I think I do," she murmured, reaching up to cup his face, her thumb brushing against his jawline. "Because I feel the same way." A low growl escaped his lips before he captured her mouth in a searing kiss, one that left her breathless and aching for more. And just like that, the world outside ceased to exist once again, as they lost themselves in each other, their bodies moving together in a rhythm that spoke of something far deeper than passion. Hours later, Katya lay sprawled across Morgan's chest, her body still humming with the aftermath of their love. His fingers traced soft patterns along her back, his touch gentle yet possessive, as if he never wanted to let her go. She closed her eyes, savoring the moment, but before she could drift into sleep, his voice broke the silence. "Katya," he murmured, his fingers tilting her chin up so she could meet his gaze, "I want to take you somewhere tonight." She blinked up at him, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Where?" A slow, mysterious smile played at the corners of his lips. "It's a surprise," he said, brushing a soft kiss against her lips, "but trust me, you'll love it." Her heart fluttered at the way he was looking at her, at the excitement in his voice. "Okay," she agreed, unable to resist the anticipation building inside her. That evening, Morgan blindfolded her before leading her into his private car, his hands never leaving hers as he guided her with gentle yet firm touches. She could feel the excitement buzzing in the air, her heart pounding as she tried to guess where he was taking her. When they finally arrived, he removed the blindfold, and Katya gasped at the breathtaking sight before her. They were standing on the rooftop of a stunning glass building, the city skyline stretching out before them, twinkling lights reflecting in the serene water of a private infinity pool. The entire rooftop was decorated with candles and white roses, a soft melody playing in the background. And in the center of it all stood a beautifully set dinner table, the golden glow of candlelight making the atmosphere even more magical. Tears welled in Katya's eyes as she turned to Morgan, her heart swelling with love. "Morgan, this is beautiful," she whispered, unable to believe that he had done all of this for her. Morgan pulled her into his arms, his fingers tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Not as beautiful as you," he murmured, his lips brushing against her forehead. They spent the evening wrapped in each other's presence, sharing stolen kisses between sips of wine, laughter mingling with whispered confessions of love. And when Morgan finally led her to the edge of the rooftop, the city lights twinkling behind them, he took both of her hands in his and looked deep into her eyes. "I meant every word I said that night, Katya," he murmured, his voice filled with unwavering determination. "I don't just want you for a few nights. I don't just want you as my lover. I want you as my wife." A sharp gasp escaped her lips as he slowly sank down on one knee, pulling a velvet box from his pocket. He opened it to reveal a breathtaking diamond ring, its brilliance reflecting the love in his eyes. "Marry me, Katya," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Be mine forever." Tears slipped down her cheeks as she looked at the man before her, the man who had once been just her boss, the man who had become her everything. She had never felt so loved, so cherished, and as she stared into his eyes, she knew there was only one answer. "Yes," she breathed, her voice trembling with happiness. "Yes, Morgan, I'll marry you." A victorious smile spread across his lips before he slipped the ring onto her finger, sealing their fate with a kiss so passionate, so consuming, that it left her breathless. And as they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the city lights shimmering around them, Katya knew that this was only the beginning of their forever. Katya could still feel the weight of Morgan's words settling into her heart, each syllable leaving an imprint on her soul. She had said yes. She had accepted his proposal, not just as an answer, but as a promise that she would be his forever, that she would surrender herself to the man who had stormed into her life and turned her world into something extraordinary. As she gazed at the sparkling diamond ring on her finger, she couldn't help but smile, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. The city skyline stretched behind them, a dazzling sea of lights mirroring the emotions coursing through her. But nothing in the world could outshine the glow in Morgan's eyes as he pulled her into his embrace, his arms wrapping around her as if he never wanted to let go. "You have no idea how much this means to me," he murmured against her hair, his voice thick with emotion. She leaned into his touch, pressing her palms against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "I do," she whispered, "because it means just as much to me." His hands tightened on her waist, possessive yet gentle. "I don't think I'll be able to wait until the wedding to make you mine again," he admitted, his voice laced with raw desire. Katya felt a delicious shiver race down her spine at his words, her body already reacting to the intensity in his gaze. "Then don't," she whispered, tilting her face up to him, her lips mere inches away from his. That was all the invitation he needed. In an instant, his lips crashed against hers, claiming her with a hunger that set her entire body on fire. He didn't kiss her like a man who had just won his prize. He kissed her like a man who had been starving for her, like a man who'd found the only thing that could ever satisfy his hunger. His hands roamed her body, tracing every curve, igniting every nerve as he backed her against the railing, his body pressing firmly against hers. The world around them faded into nothingness, the city lights, the stars, the gentle breeze. All of it became insignificant in the face of the passion that raged between them. Morgan's fingers tangled in her hair as he deepened the kiss, his tongue sliding against hers in a slow, sensual dance that made her knees go weak. She clung to him, her nails digging into his back as she surrendered to the fire consuming them. He growled against her lips, lifting her effortlessly into his arms, carrying her through the rooftop doors and into the penthouse. Their breaths came in ragged gasps as he set her down on the plush bed, his eyes never leaving hers as he slowly unbuttoned his shirt, revealing the chiseled perfection of his body. Katya's lips parted, her gaze trailing over every ridge of muscle, every inch of the man who had become her everything. "You're staring," he teased, a smirk tugging at his lips. She smiled, reaching out to trace her fingers along his chest. "Can you blame me?" His expression darkened with desire as he leaned over her, his hands sliding beneath the fabric of her dress, pushing it up inch by inch until it pooled around her waist. "You drive me insane, Katya," he murmured against her skin, his lips trailing down her neck, her collarbone lower. "Every single part of you." A moan escaped her lips as he worshipped her with his touch, his mouth, his body. They lost themselves in each other, in the passion that burned between them, in the love that had taken root so deeply that it consumed them both. The night stretched on, their bodies entwined, their hearts beating as one, their love cemented in whispers and sighs. When the morning light streamed through the windows, Katya stirred in Morgan's arms, a satisfied ache settling in her limbs. She turned her head, her eyes meeting his, and her breath caught at the way he was looking at her. It was a look of pure adoration, of a man who had found everything he had ever wanted in the woman lying beside him. "Good morning, fiancé," he murmured, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. She smiled, her fingers tracing lazy patterns along his chest. "Good morning, future husband." A deep chuckle rumbled in his chest as he tightened his arms around her, pulling her even closer. "I like the sound of that," he admitted, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "So do I," she whispered, gazing up at him. Morgan studied her for a long moment, his expression turning serious. "Katya," he murmured, his fingers tilting her chin up, "I want you to know something." She swallowed, her heart pounding. "What is it?" He took a deep breath as if steadying himself before he spoke. "You're the only woman I have ever truly loved. Before you, my world was cold, filled with business deals and responsibilities, but you You brought warmth into my life. You made me feel things I never thought I was capable of feeling." His eyes searched hers, raw emotion flickering in their depths. "And I promise you, for as long as I live, I will cherish you, protect you, and love you with everything I have." Tears welled in her eyes as she listened to his words, her heart swelling with a love so deep it threatened to consume her. She reached up, cupping his face in her hands. "And I promise you, Morgan, I will stand by your side through everything. I will love you, support you, and be yours in every way that matters." Morgan inhaled sharply, as if overwhelmed by her words, before crashing his lips against hers once more. The kiss was slow, filled with promise, with devotion, with the unspoken vows that bound them together. As they lay there wrapped in each other's arms, Katya knew that no matter what the future held, one thing was certain: her heart belonged to Morgan, just as his belonged to her. Their love was unstoppable, unbreakable, eternal, and in that moment she knew without a doubt that their happiest days were still ahead of them. The morning sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting a golden glow over the penthouse bedroom. Katya stirred in Morgan's arms, her heart swelling with warmth as she felt his steady breathing against her. His strong arms were wrapped around her possessively, as if he never wanted to let go. A smile tugged at her lips as she turned slightly, gazing up at him. His handsome face, usually hardened by the weight of the world, looked peaceful in sleep. She reached up, brushing her fingers against his jawline, feeling the slight stubble that made him even more irresistible. As if sensing her touch, Morgan's eyes fluttered open. The moment his gaze met hers, a slow smile curved his lips. "Good morning, my love," he murmured, his voice husky from sleep. Katya's heart skipped a beat at the endearment. "Good morning, my fiancé," she teased, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. Morgan chuckled, rolling over to pin her beneath him, his weight pressing deliciously against her. "Not for long," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her lips. "Soon you'll be my wife." The thought sent a shiver down her spine. In just a few weeks, they would stand before the world and vow to love each other forever. It still felt like a dream, one she never wanted to wake up from. As if reading her thoughts, Morgan brushed his fingers through her hair, his eyes filled with tenderness. "Are you happy, Katya?" She gazed at him, her heart swelling with love. "I've never been happier." His expression softened even more. "Good," he murmured, kissing her deeply, as if sealing a promise. "Because I plan to spend the rest of my life making sure you stay that way." A wedding fit for a queen. The weeks flew by in a whirlwind of preparations. Morgan insisted on giving Katya the wedding of her dreams, sparing no expense. The ceremony was set in a breathtaking location, a luxurious estate overlooking the ocean, with white roses and golden lights adorning every corner. On the day of the wedding, Katya stood before the mirror, dressed in an exquisite gown that hugged her curves before flaring out into a cascade of lace. The diamond necklace Morgan had gifted her rested against her collarbone, a symbol of his love. Her heart pounded as she held the bouquet in her trembling hands. This was it. She was about to become Morgan's wife. When the doors opened and she stepped into the aisle, her breath hitched. Morgan stood at the altar, looking devastatingly handsome in his black tuxedo. But it wasn't his appearance that made her knees weak. It was the way he was looking at her. His eyes were filled with an intensity that stole her breath. A love so deep it was almost tangible. As she walked toward him, every step felt like a promise, every heartbeat a vow. When she finally reached him, he took her hands in his, squeezing them gently. "You are the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Tears pricked at her eyes as the ceremony began. They exchanged vows, promising to love each other through every storm and sunshine. And when Morgan finally slid the wedding ring onto her finger, sealing their union, he whispered against her lips, "You're mine now, Katya, forever." As they kissed, the world around them faded, and all that remained was the love that bound them together. The wedding night was a blur of passion and whispered promises. Morgan carried Katya into their honeymoon suite, his eyes dark with desire. He made love to her with a tenderness that left her breathless, worshipping every inch of her body, as if she were the most precious thing in the world. That night, as they lay tangled in the sheets, Morgan held her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I have something to tell you," he murmured. Katya looked up at him, curiosity flickering in her gaze. "What is it?" Morgan exhaled deeply. "I never thought I'd fall in love," he admitted. "Before you, my life was about business, about control. I never let myself feel, but you changed everything." His fingers brushed against her cheek. "You made me want more than just success. You made me want happiness. And now I can't imagine my life without you." Tears slipped down Katya's cheeks as she cupped his face. "Morgan, I love you so much." His eyes softened. "Say it again." She smiled through her tears. "I love you." A satisfied smirk curved his lips as he rolled over her, pinning her beneath him. "Good," he whispered, his voice filled with possessive hunger, "because I plan to keep you saying it every single night for the rest of our lives." And he did. A beautiful surprise. Months later, Katya sat in their bedroom, staring at the pregnancy test in her hands. Her heart pounded as she saw the two pink lines. Tears filled her eyes, tears of joy, of disbelief. When Morgan came home that evening, she met him at the door, her hands trembling. "What's wrong?" he asked, his brows furrowing in concern. Katya took a deep breath before placing his hand on her stomach. "Morgan, we're going to have a baby." For the first time in his life, the powerful CEO looked utterly speechless. His eyes widened, his lips parting as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard, and then a slow, beautiful smile spread across his face. "A baby," he repeated, his voice shaking. Katya nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Yes." Without warning, Morgan pulled her into his arms, lifting her off the ground as he spun her around. "We're having a baby," he laughed, his voice filled with pure happiness. He pressed kisses all over her face before resting his forehead against hers. "Katya, you've given me everything I never knew I needed." She wrapped her arms around his neck. "And you've given me the greatest love I could ever dream of." Months later, as Morgan held their newborn daughter in his arms, his heart swelled with a love so profound it brought tears to his eyes. He looked at Katya, who lay in the hospital bed, exhausted yet radiant. "You are my everything," he whispered, pressing a kiss to their daughter's tiny forehead before turning to Katya. "Both of you." Katya smiled, reaching out to touch his face. "And you are ours." Morgan leaned down, capturing her lips in a kiss filled with love and devotion. As he held his family in his arms, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: this was forever. Their love had begun on a mountain, in a night of passion, but it had turned into something much greater. It had become unbreakable, unstoppable, eternal. And as he looked into Katya's eyes, Morgan knew that their love story wasn't ending. It was just the beginning.